"Don't eat that," the little girl whispered, her voice a fragile sliver of silver cutting through the heavy, gold-leaf silence of the grand dining hall. The air in the grand dining hall of the Moretti estate didn't just smell of wealth. It smelled of antiquity, expensive cigar smoke, and the cold, metallic tang of unspoken threats. Dante Moretti, the undisputed king of the city's underground, sat at the head of a 30-foot mahogany table, a piece of furniture that had seen more death warrants signed upon its surface than holiday feasts. Above him, a massive crystal chandelier hummed with a low electric frequency, casting jagged shadows of Roman statues against the velvet-draped walls. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a pre-wedding feast to solidify a fragile truce between warring bloodlines. And now the silence in the room was gold-leafed and heavy, a suffocating pressure that suggested the statues were witnesses to a funeral rather than a celebration. Dante's presence alone was enough to pin the air to the floor. He sat with a rigid, military grace, his broad shoulders filling out a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most men made in a year. His hands, large and calloused from years of holding both triggers and the reins of an empire, rested lightly on the table. To his left sat Victor, his cousin and right-hand man, whose jovial laughter usually filled these halls, but was noticeably absent tonight. To his right was Bianca Valenti, his fiancée, a woman whose beauty was as sharp as a razor and just as dangerous. She was the peace offering, the bridge between the Morettis and the Valentis, and yet she sat with a stillness that felt like a coiled spring. The service was impeccable, a choreographed dance of white-gloved waiters gliding over marble floors that were polished to a mirror shine. They moved with a ghostly silence, placing plates of seared sea bass, drizzled in a rich, vibrant saffron reduction, before the guests. The steam curled upward in elegant ribbons, carrying the earthy, floral scent of the world's most expensive spice. It was a meal designed to impress, to disarm, and to satisfy. Dante looked down at his plate. The saffron sauce shimmered under the artificial light, a liquid gold that seemed to promise a future of prosperity and peace. He lifted his silver fork. The weight of it was familiar, a solid tool of a civilized man. He cut a small piece of the fish and ate the flesh flaking perfectly under the pressure of the tine. "Don't eat that." The voice was a fragile sliver of silver, so thin and high-pitched that it almost vanished into the heavy velvet drapes before it reached his ears. Dante's hand stopped. He didn't flinch. He didn't tremble. He simply froze, the piece of fish hovering at the threshold of his lips. The steam touched his skin, warm and inviting, but the words had cast an instant, sub-zero chill over his blood. He didn't look up immediately. He waited, his eyes fixed on the saffron-stained fish, listening to the sudden, sharp intake of breath from the capos seated down the table. He turned his head slowly. Standing at the edge of the deep shadows thrown by the marble pillars was Bella. She was 6 years old, an orphan of a fallen soldier, wearing a simple cotton nightgown that looked out of place in this room of silk and iron. Her hair was a wild halo of dark curls, and her eyes were wide, twin pools of crystalline terror. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in the North Wing, tucked away from the business of men who traded in blood. But there she was, her small, pale hand pointed directly at his plate. Her finger was shaking so violently that it looked like a flickering candle flame. Dante's gaze locked onto hers, and in that moment, the power dynamic of the room shifted. The Mafia king, a man who could command the deaths of hundreds with a nod, was being held captive by the whisper of a child. Dante lowered the fork. The motion was slow, deliberate, and laden with a terrifying gravity. The clatter of the silver hitting the fine, bone china echoed through the cavernous hall like a gunshot, the sound bouncing off the high, arched ceilings until it died in the heavy drapes. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath, of a fuse burning toward a barrel of gunpowder. He pushed his chair back, the heavy oak legs groaning against the marble, a discordant screech that set everyone's teeth on edge. Dante didn't look at Victor, whose face had suddenly become a mask of pale, waxy sweat. He didn't look at Bianca, whose hand had tightened around the stem of her wine glass until her knuckles were the color of bone. He only looked at the girl. "Bella," Dante said. His voice was a low, melodic growl, a sound that usually sent tremors of fear through his enemies. But now it was softened, now textured with a dangerous curiosity. "Step into the light." The girl hesitated, her small, worn shoes clicking softly as she moved out of the shadows. She looked pathetically small under the massive crystal chandeliers, a speck of innocence in a room built on sin. As she approached, Dante noticed the smear of soot on her hem and the way her chest heaved in shallow, panicked gasps. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't seeking attention. She was a witness to something that had turned her world into a nightmare. Dante knelt on the cold marble, a gesture of humility that made every capo in the room lean forward in shock. He was eye level with her now. He reached out a hand, his fingers calloused and scarred, and gently tucked a stray hair behind her ear. Her skin was like ice. She was trembling with a force that seemed to vibrate through Dante's own body. "Tell me what you saw, Bella," he whispered. The girl's lips parted, but for a second no sound came out. She looked at the plate of fish on the table, then at the kitchen doors, then back to Dante. The suspicion that had been a low-frequency hum in the back of Dante's brain began to build into a roar. He looked back at the saffron sauce. Now that he was closer, now that the child had broken the spell, he saw it. The faint, oily sheen that didn't belong to the oil or the spice. It was a beautiful, oily rainbow on the surface of his death. The atmosphere in the room turned brittle. Dante could feel the eyes of his capos drilling into the back of his neck. He could hear the heavy, irregular breathing of Victor to his left. He knew that the moment he acknowledged the poison, the truce would end and the war would begin. But he also knew that he couldn't take a bite of that fish. Not after looking into those crystalline eyes. He stood up, his tall frame looming over the table once more, a dark monolith of vengeance. He reached for the plate, his fingers gripping the cold porcelain. The room held its breath. This was the hook that would pull them all into the abyss. Dante didn't look at the poison. He looked at his cousin. The betrayal was sitting there, shimmering in gold sauce, and the only person who had the courage to speak was the one person who had no voice in this world. Dante's hand tightened on the plate. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man who had been saved by a ghost. And now, he was going to make sure the ghosts got their justice. In the silence that followed the clatter of Dante's fork was not empty. It was a masterclass in atmospheric dread, a thick, suffocating fog that seemed to swallow the light from the chandeliers. Dante remained kneeling for a moment longer, his hand still lingering near Bella's shoulder, feeling the rhythmic, frantic tremors of her body. Every second that passed felt like an hour. The air in the Moretti mansion, usually heavy, with the scent of aged mahogany and the finest tobacco, now felt thin, sterile, and metallic, like the air inside a pressurized cabin minutes before a crash. Dante rose to his full height, his shadow stretching across the table like a dark shroud. He didn't look at the girl anymore. He turned his slate-gray eyes toward the guests. To his left, Victor, his cousin, his blood, and the man who had been his shadow since they were boys, stealing bread in the gutters, was sitting perfectly still. But it was the wrong kind of still. Victor was a man of immense, boisterous energy. His silence was a confession. Dante watched as a single bead of sweat escaped Victor's hairline, tracing a slow, glistening path down a face that had turned the color of wet parchment. To his right, Bianca Valenti, his fiancée, was staring at the far wall. She was a vision of ivory and silk, but her knuckles were white as she gripped the stem of her crystal wine glass. She wasn't looking at Dante. She was looking at a painting of a storm at sea, her chest rising and falling in shallow, controlled sips of air. She was waiting. They were all waiting for the king to choke. Dante's survival instinct, a primal, a low-frequency hum he had honed through decades of street wars and back-alley executions, began to vibrate in the base of his skull. It was an alarm that the child's whisper had just validated. He looked back at his plate, leaning in until the steam of the saffron sea bass touched his nose. Under the harsh, direct glare of the crystal lights, he saw it clearly now. A faint, oily, pearlescent sheen on the golden sauce. It was a subtle, beautiful rainbow of death. A specialized neurotoxin designed to paralyze the lungs while keeping the mind agonizingly awake. The suspicion began to crystallize into a terrifying picture. Dante didn't just see the poison. He saw the architecture of the coop. He scanned the room with the clinical precision of a predator. The first realization: Victor, who usually boasted the loudest and ate the fastest, and had an untouched plate. His silverware lay in a perfect, unused alignment, a stark contrast to his usual messy appetite. He was satisfied merely to watch Dante eat. The second realization: Dante's gaze shifted to the doorway. Lorenzo, his head of security for 6 years, was standing by the entrance. But Lorenzo wasn't scanning the perimeter or checking the windows. He was staring directly at the back of Dante's head. His hand wasn't on his radio. It was resting with practiced familiarity on the grip of his silent sidearm. The wolf wasn't at the door. The wolf was guarding the flock. The third realization: the kitchen staff. Dante noticed that the head chef, a man who had served the Morettis for 2 decades, was missing. None of the men who had brought out the plates were unfamiliar. Hard-eyed men with the thick necks and calloused hands of mercenaries, poorly disguised in waiters' whites. The twist wasn't just that there was poison in the fish. It was that the entire room had been replaced while he was looking at the guest list. His home had been hollowed out. Every pillar of his empire had been quietly swapped for a Valenti blade. Bianca wasn't a bride. She was a Trojan horse. Victor wasn't a brother. He was the one who had opened the gates. Dante felt a cold, sickening pang of betrayal, a jagged shard of glass twisting in his chest. The man who had shared his first stolen meal was now sitting by, waiting to watch him suffocate for the sake of a throne made of glass. Dante didn't roar. He didn't reach for his gun. That would be too quick, too merciful. He wanted them to feel the weight of their failure before the first bullet flew. He reached out and picked up his plate. The china felt cold against his fingers. He walked slowly around the head of the table, his boots echoing on the marble like the ticking of a doomsday clock. He stopped behind Victor. The cousin didn't flinch, but his breathing became a series of ragged, wet hitches. "Bella says the food is bad," Dante stated, his tone eerily flat, devoid of any warmth. The sound of his voice seemed to rattle the crystal glasses on the table. He slid the plate of poisoned fish in front of Victor. The screech of the porcelain against the mahogany sounded like a gavel striking a death sentence. Dante leaned down, his lips inches from Victor's ear, the scent of the saffron now a sickening shroud between them. "Victor," Dante whispered, the sound vibrating through the very wood of the table. "You've always praised our chef. You always say that a man who doesn't enjoy his meal doesn't deserve his life. Why don't you show the little girl there's nothing to be afraid of?" Victor's hands began to shake, his fingers twitching near the edge of the tablecloth. He looked down at the shimmering sea bass, the oily sheen reflecting the terror in his own eyes. He knew exactly what was in that sauce. He knew that one bite would turn his body into a living coffin. "Take a bite, cousin," Dante commanded, his voice dropping into a low, melodic growl that filled every corner of the hall. "For the family, for the loyalty you've shown me all these years." Bianca finally turned her head, her eyes wide and dark, with a predatory fear. The mask was slipping. The mercury mask of the inner circle was melting under the heat of Dante's gaze. The betrayal was no longer a secret, whispered in the dark. It was a physical object sitting on a plate in the center of the light. Dante stood back, watching the beads of sweat turn into a river on Victor's face. He knew the mercenaries were waiting for a signal, and he knew Lorenzo was a heartbeat away from drawing his weapon. But for this one crystalline moment, the king was still in control, and the traitors were forced to look at the poison they had brewed. The realization that the betrayal was absolute, that the bride was a killer, and that the only truth left in the Moretti mansion was the shaking hand of a 6-year-old girl. Dante's hand moved toward the edge of the table, his muscles coiling. He wasn't waiting for a confession anymore. He was waiting for the first person to break the silence with a scream. The air in the dining hall had reached a point of absolute stasis, a vacuum where even the sound of the ticking clock seemed to have died. Victor sat frozen, staring at the plate of saffron-glazed death that Dante had slid before him. The oily, pearlescent sheen of the neurotoxin shimmered like a mocking smile under the chandelier's light. Dante stood over him, a dark monolith of impending judgment, his presence pressing down on Victor until the cousin's chair creaked under the weight of his fear. "Eat," Dante repeated. The word wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum that vibrated through the floorboards. Victor's hand twitched, a spasmodic jerk toward his waist. But his courage failed him. He looked up at Dante, and in his eyes there was no more cousin, either no more brother, only the predator he had tried and failed to kill. Bianca, on the other side of the table, finally broke. Her glass of wine slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble with a sharp, crystalline ring that acted as the starting gun for the apocalypse. The mouse. Bella's voice rose, no longer a whisper, but a thin, piercing cry that shattered the last of the tension. She pointed her small, trembling finger toward the heavy, floor-to-ceiling, velvet curtains near the service entrance. Dante didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that defied his massive frame, crossing the distance to the drapes in 3 heavy strides. With a violent, guttural roar, he ripped the velvet fabric from its brass mountings. The heavy material fell in a heap, revealing the final, undeniable proof. There, on the polished marble, lay a small field mouse. Its tiny body was arched in a grotesque, rigid spasm, its paws frozen in midair, as if trying to claw its way out of an invisible cage. It had nibbled on a scrap of the bast that must have fallen during the frantic plating in the kitchen. The poison had worked with surgical, terrifying speed. Dante turned back to the table, his eyes blazing with a lethal, sacrificial light. The mouse didn't enjoy its meal, Victor. Why should I? The room erupted. It wasn't the slow buildup of a typical argument. It was a total, scorched earth explosion of lethal motion. Victor lunged for the submachine gun he had hidden in a holster beneath the mahogany table. Lorenzo, the head of security, drew his silent sidearm, aiming for the center of Dante's back. But Dante Moretti had been born in the fires of the street, times when he was already 5 moves ahead of the betrayal. Before Victor's fingers could even touch the trigger, Dante reached down and gripped the edge of the 30-foot mahogany table. With a roar of primal, adrenaline-fueled strength that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting, he heaved the 3-ton piece of furniture upward. The table flipped onto its side with a thunderous crash, sending plates of poisoned fish, crystal decanters of 100-year-old scotch, and silver candelabras flying through the air like shrapnel. The heavy wood became a barricade, a shield between Dante and the men he had once called brothers. A hail of bullets immediately tore through the air, but they weren't coming from the table. From the ornate arch balcony above, Valenti snipers opened fire. The rhythmic, yet staccato thwip, thwip, thwip of silenced rounds chewed through the wood of the table and the plaster of the pillars. The betrayal was absolute. Bianca hadn't just brought her heart to the wedding. She had brought a death squad. Dante didn't reach for his own weapon yet. His first instinct, his only instinct, was the girl. He dove through the hail of ceramic shards and flying glass, sliding across the marble floor to where Bella stood paralyzed by the pillar. He scooped her into his arms, shielding her small, fragile body with his own heavy, tactical vest and broad shoulders. He could feel the impact of the debris hitting his back, but he didn't flinch. "Hold your ears, Bella," he roared over the cacophony of breaking glass and gunfire. He didn't take the main exits. He knew Lorenzo would have the hallways bottlenecked. Instead, Dante crashed through the service door, his boots thundering down the narrow, dimly lit corridors used by the staff. Behind him, he heard Victor's panicked screams for the mercenaries to pursue. He navigated the labyrinthine back end of the estate with a predator's instinct. Every turn a memory of a house that had now turned into a slaughterhouse. He reached the subterranean level, where the air grew cold and smelled of damp limestone. This was the heart of the fortress. He arrived at the heavy steel door of the primary safe room. With a steady hand, he punched in the emergency override code, a sequence known only to him. The hydraulic bolts retracted with a slow, agonizing hiss of pressurized air. He stepped inside and placed Bella on the floor. The safe room was a stark, windowless vault of reinforced steel and humming servers. It bathed in the eerie, rhythmic red of the emergency lights. Dante knelt one more time, his hands gripping Bella's shoulders. He was breathing hard, the scent of gunpowder and saffron still clinging to his skin. "Listen to me, Bella," he said, his voice cracking with a rare, raw emotion. "You saved my life tonight. You are the only truth left in this house. Now you have to be the brave girl I know you are. Lock this door from the inside. Do not open it for anyone. Not for Victor. Not for Bianca. Not even for the police. Only for me. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, clutching her battered doll to her chest, her eyes searching Dante's face for a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Dante kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt like a final goodbye and a baptism all at once. He stepped back out into the cold, dark hallway. Thus the heavy steel door hissed shut, the sound of the bolts sliding into place sounding like the closing of a tomb. Dante stood in the red-lit darkness, alone. He reached into his waistband and finally drew his weapon. The metallic click of the slide chambering around, echoing in the silence. Through the small, reinforced observation slit, he saw the monitors. The mercenaries were already in the basement. Victor and Bianca were leading them, their faces twisted in a desperate, animalistic greed. They weren't just coming for him. They were coming to erase the only witness. Dante's jaw tightened. He wasn't just a mafia boss protecting his territory anymore. He was a guardian standing at the gates of hell. He checked his magazine, his eyes reflecting the lethal crimson pulse of the alarms. "I'm coming for you, Victor," he whispered into the shadows. The king had secured his jewel. Now he was going to burn the kingdom to the ground to make sure the ashes stayed cold. Dante turned away from the door and vanished into the darkness, ready to turn the subterranean corridors into a massacre for those who had dared to poison his table. The subterranean corridors of the Moretti estate had become a labyrinth of fire and shadows. Dante moved through the haze like a phantom of vengeance, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the concrete. The betrayal was no longer a mystery. It was a physical weight he carried in his chest. He reached the secondary security hub, the black box, where the true history of the family was stored in cold, digital silence. With bloodied fingers, he bypassed the biometric locks and began the download. On the monitors, the evidence laid itself bare. He saw the video of Bianca and Victor laughing about the toxin. He saw the ledgers showing millions funneled to the White Lily. The desecration of his mother's name was the final spark. Dante didn't just want them dead, he wanted them erased. He snatched the encrypted drive, tucking it into his boot, and headed back toward the safe room just as the first explosion rocked the wing. He found Victor standing before the mangled, smoking door of Bella's sanctuary, holding a thermal breach charge. The cousin was screaming into the smoke, a man who had traded his soul for a throne and found only a furnace. Dante didn't shout. He didn't offer a plea. He stepped out of the shadows, his silhouette framed by the rhythmic, strobe-like flickering of the red emergency lights. The muzzle flash of his sidearm illuminated the hallway in staccato bursts. He didn't kill Victor immediately. He clipped the stone pillar beside his head, a terrifying declaration that the king was here to collect his debt. Victor scrambled into the ruins of the laundry room, leaving the path to Bella clear. Dante reached the girl, scooping her up from beneath an overturned steel desk. She was a ghost-gray figure in the soot, clutching her doll as if it were the only anchor in a world turned to ash. "I didn't eat it, Uncle Dante," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of silver. "I stayed in the dark like you told me." Dante's heart, a block of granite for 20 years, finally cracked. He shielded her with his own body, walking not through the secret exits, but right through the grand center of his burning palace. Moa, he wanted the traitors to see him. He wanted them to see the man they thought was a corpse, walking through the flames with a child in his arms. When he kicked open the doors to the ruined dining hall, the scene was a graveyard of elegance. Bianca and Victor stood there, surrounded by Valenti mercenaries who were already looking for the exits. Bianca's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at the man she'd tried to poison, and the child who had exposed her. "The chef was a better cook than a chemist, Bianca," Dante said, his voice a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate the very air. He set Bella down behind a marble pillar and activated the projection screens. The hall was suddenly filled with the booming, high-definition sound of Bianca's own voice from the black box, detailing the murder plot. The Valenti soldiers, seeing their employers exposed as sloppy amateurs, lowered their rifles. They weren't going to die for a couple of fools. "This is the end, Victor," Dante said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The accounts are frozen. The ledgers are with the feds. You have no money, no soldiers, and in 5 minutes, you won't even have a name." The final reckoning was primal. Dante disarmed Victor with a bone-snapping strike and pinned him to the mahogany table, the very table where they had sat as brothers. He looked at Bianca, who was trying to slip away. "The police are at the gates, Bianca. I'm turning it all over. The Moretti name ends tonight, and so do you." But the shadow of the Valenti family, Lorenzo, made one last desperate move. He aimed his rifle at the pillar where Bella's hand was visible. Without a heartbeat of hesitation, Dante threw the drive, his only leverage and proof of innocence, across the room and lunged toward the girl. The roar of the shot was deafening. Dante felt the searing heat of the bullet through his shoulder as he wrapped his body around Bella. He had traded his empire and his freedom for her life. As the tactical lights of the police swarmed the hall, Dante looked into Bella's eyes and whispered, "The monsters are gone." The epilogue, 10 years later. The transition from the iron bars of a federal cell to the wild, unburdened beauty of the coast had taken 5 years of Dante's life. He had spent that time paying for the sins of his past, writing letters to a girl he had saved, and watching through a small window as the Moretti Empire was dismantled and turned into youth centers and parks. Now, the sun was beginning its slow, golden descent toward the Atlantic waves. Dante drove a modest car up the gravel path of a small, white-shingled house on the cliffs. There were no guards here. There were no cameras. The air smelled of wild lavender and sea salt. He stepped out of the car, moving with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the night he chose a child over a kingdom. Standing at the edge of the cliff was a young woman of 16, her dark hair flowing in the wind like a silken banner. Bella turned, and the memory of the soot-covered child in the nightgown was replaced by the vibrant reality of the woman she had become. She didn't whisper this time. She ran. She collided with him with the force of a tidal wave, her arms wrapping around his waist. Dante buried his face in her shoulder, more the scent of sunshine washing away the last lingering smell of the prison. "You're late for dinner," she said, her voice bright and steady. Dante sat at the wooden table on the sun-drenched deck. Before them was a simple tray of fresh fruit, warm bread, and grilled fish. There was no saffron sauce. There was no oily sheen. Bella looked at him, a mischievous glint in her eyes, and mimicked her own 6-year-old self. "Don't eat that," she said, her voice perfect. Dante froze, his hand hovering over his plate, the old-world concern flashing in his gray eyes for a split second before Bella burst into a bright, melodic laugh. "I'm kidding, Dad. It just needs more lemon." Dante let out a long, shuddering breath and smiled. The moral justice of his life wasn't found in the power he once wielded, but in the peace he had earned. He squeezed her hand, the same hand that had once pointed at a poisoned plate and changed the course of history. The Mafia boss had dropped his fork, and in doing so, he had finally sat down to a feast that would never end. The kingdom of gold and glass was gone, replaced by a home built on the only thing that was real, the truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold, the legacy of the Morettis was finally at peace. This was more than just a story of a fallen empire. It was a testament to the power of a single truth in a world built on lies. Dante and Bella's journey reminds us that redemption isn't something you find. It's something you build, one honest choice at a time. If you believe that family isn't just about the blood you share, but about the people you would take a bullet for, please give this video a like. Subscribe to our channel for more emotionally intense, long-form stories that explore the depths of human loyalty and the triumph of the innocent over the corrupt. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a cinematic drama like this one. We want to hear from you. Share your feelings in the comments below. How did you feel when Dante threw away his only evidence to save Bella? What was your favorite moment of justice in this reckoning? We read every single one of your stories and value your presence in our community. Thank you for watching and for being part of this journey with us. Until the next story, keep the light burning and the truth alive.